The 13th mouth of hell. The air itself seemed to thicken as Nathan Hale approached Blackthorn Cathedral, not with mist, but with a palpable dread that settled in the chest like a stone. It had been weeks of the whispers, the hushed reports filtering through the town, each one a tendril of unease coiling around the heart of the old settlement, the chanting. Not hymns, not prayers, but something ancient, guttural, that clawed at the quiet sanctity of the night. Nathan, an American theology student whose intellect often wrestled with his faith, had felt an insistent pull, a perverse scholarly curiosity mixed with a spiritual alarm bell ringing deep within his soul. He had come, not entirely by choice, but by a sense of duty, or perhaps a morbid compulsion he couldn't name. The cathedral stood silhouetted against a bruised, moonless sky, a skeletal edifice of blackened stone and decaying spires. Its Gothic maw of an entrance seemed to gape, not inviting, but threatening to swallow the very light from the world. Centuries of neglect and whispered curses had etched themselves into every crumbling gargoyle, every fractured archway. The very ground beneath Nathan's worn boots felt cold, alien, as if the earth itself recoiled from the edifice. A frigid gust, smelling of damp soil and something metallic like old blood, whipped around him, plucking at his jacket. He clutched the heavy iron ring of the massive oak door, its surface gritty with generations of grime and what felt like a fine, clinging ash. From within, it began, a low, resonant hum, an undertone that vibrated through the ancient wood of the door and up into Nathan's bones. It was not a single voice, but a chorus, dozens of them, overlapping and discordant, yet strangely unified in their horrifying purpose. It was not music. It was liturgy, yes, but one born of an abyss, whispered into existence by throats that had never known light. Sanctum caro, aperite portum mortis. The words, ancient Latin, were clear enough to Nathan's trained ears, yet their intent was a dagger of ice to his spirit. Holy flesh, open the gate of death. He pushed. The door, heavier than any he had ever encountered, groaned open with a sound like a beast stirring from a long, tormented sleep. A gust of fetid hair, thick with the cloying sweetness of decay, and a sharp, coppery tang assaulted him. It was the scent of a slaughterhouse, but one where the victims had once walked on two legs. Nathan stepped across the threshold, and the door slammed shut behind him with an earth-shaking thud that echoed through the vast, unseen interior, plunging him into a darkness so absolute it seemed to possess a physical weight. His small, trembling flashlight beam pierced the gloom, a fragile spear against an ocean of shadow. The light danced, revealing fragmented horrors, each one a hammer blow to his theological sensibilities. The nave stretched before him, an unholy expanse where the sacred had been violently twisted into the profane. Crucifixes, dozens of them, lined the walls, but they were no longer symbols of sacrifice and redemption. Each one was inverted, the Savior's broken form hanging upside down, his head scraping the dust-laden floor. But it was not the inversion that truly sickened Nathan, it was the grotesque adornments. Entwined around each wooden beam, wrapped tightly around the inverted corpus, were glistening ropes of human intestines. They were not dried and ancient, but slick with a fresh, viscous sheen, their convoluted coils emitting a faint, sickening odor. Some were still faintly pulsing, as if a recent, terrible harvest had just been completed. The sight made Nathan's stomach churn, a bitter acid rising in his throat. His beam swung further, catching glimpses of stained glass windows, once vibrant portrayals of saints and biblical scenes. Now they were fractured, spiderwebbed with cracks that wept black, viscous fluid, as if the very glass itself was bleeding from within its leaded veins. The moonlight, where it managed to penetrate, painted the floor with warped, grotesque patterns of this dark ichor. Nathan's breath hitched. The source of the metallic, sweet decay became horrifyingly clear as his light settled on the altar, the sacred heart of any cathedral. Here, the desecration reached its zenith. The massive stone slab was no longer adorned with consecrated cloths or liturgical instruments. Instead, it was a tableau of visceral art, a canvas of fresh, glistening organs. A human heart, still vaguely engorged, sat at the center of a perfectly formed pentagram, its points delineated by other vital organs, lungs, liver, kidneys, and what looked disturbingly like a brain, meticulously arranged. Tendrils of scarlet blood, still wet and shimmering, connected them, forming the unholy symbol. The surface of the altar beneath them was stained a deep, unholy crimson, the stone itself seeming to weep the gore. The chanting, which had been a low, thrumming undercurrent, now swelled, becoming more distinct, more insistent. Sanctum, caro, aperite portum mortis, agramor, agramor, 13th mouth. The words echoed off the vaulted ceilings, each syllable a serrated edge against Nathan's sanity. It was no longer dozens of voices, but hundreds, perhaps thousands, a layered cacophony that seemed to emanate from the very stone, from the air itself. Some voices were deep and guttural, like the growl of a predator. Others were high-pitched, reedy, almost like a child's shriek, all woven into a tapestry of pure, unadulterated blasphemy. Statues of saints and angels, once serene and benevolent, stood along the periphery, their features now contorted into silent screams of agony. From their empty eye sockets, black blood, thick and tar-like, streamed down their marble cheeks, etching dark paths into the pallid stone. Their robes were soaked, their pedestals pooled with the viscous fluid, which shimmered faintly in the meager light, reflecting the inverted crucifixes like monstrous, distorted eyes. The sight was a violation of everything Nathan had ever believed, a physical manifestation of a spiritual cancer that had devoured this holy place. And then the candles, rows upon rows of them, flickering along the altar, on makeshift pedestals, even hanging suspended from the ceiling by chains. But these were no ordinary flames. They burned with an unnatural, ethereal blue light, impossibly vivid against the crushing gloom. They did not merely burn, they wept light, a silent, flickering lament that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the air. From each blue flame emanated a faint, high-pitched keening, a soundless shriek that resonated not in the ears, but in the brittle chambers of the soul. It was the sound of pure anguish compressed into light, a wailing lament that seemed to peel away layers of Nathan's composure. The cold within the cathedral was not merely a temperature, it was an active entity, a damp, crawling dread that seeped into his skin, settled in his bones, and threatened to freeze the very blood in his veins. The air, heavy with the stench of iron, decay, and the unholy ozone produced by the blue flames, felt thick and suffocating. Every breath Nathan took was shallow, tasting of rust and spiritual corruption. He found himself slowly, irrevocably drawn deeper into the nave, his flashlight beam trembling, his gaze darting from one unspeakable horror to the next. His theological training, once his anchor, now felt like a broken compass, spinning wildly in the face of such profound evil. This was not merely sacrilege, this was an active, living affront to the divine, a deliberate tearing of the veil between worlds. The chanting grew louder, more urgent, pulling him further into the heart of the desecration. The words, once distant, now throbbed around him, inside him, like a second monstrous heartbeat. Sanctum caro, aperite portam mortis, agramor, 13th mouth. It felt as though 1,000 throats torn open to sing the praises of the void were surrounding him, their voices layering, twisting, knotting into a discordant symphony of pure, unadulterated terror. He could feel the vibrations in his teeth, a dull ache behind his eyes. He stumbled forward, his gaze fixed on the altar, on the grotesque pentagram of organs, on the shimmering black blood. He was no longer a detached observer, a scholar of faith. He was a trespasser, a witness, and the cathedral, alive with its unholy chorus and its visceral decor, had become a maw, slowly closing around him. The blue flames screamed their silent agony, the black blood wept from stone eyes, and the inverted Christs hung, suffering eternally, as the voices chanted a welcoming hymn for something unspeakable. Nathan Hale was no longer in a church. He was inside a living blasphemy, and the ritual, he knew with a sickening certainty, was far from over. Part 2. Nathan Hale felt less like he was walking and more like he was being inexorably drawn, a marionette with unseen strings pulled by the cacophony of the damned. The chanting, once a distant echo, now vibrated through his very teeth, a physical assault that blurred the edges of his vision. Sanctum caro, aperite portum mortis, agramor, agramor, 13th mouth. The words were not merely sounds, they were incantations, spells woven into the very fabric of the air, tightening around him with each step. His flashlight beam, a pathetic defiance against the engulfing darkness, trembled in his grip, painting fleeting, grotesque tableaus on the cathedral's desecrated canvas. The air grew heavier, thick with an almost palpable pressure, as if the atmosphere itself was being compressed. The stench of iron and decay intensified, now laced with a new, acrid note, like burnt hair and ozone. The blue flames, lining the altar and scattered throughout the nave, flared brighter, their silent screams sharpening, a chorus of pure, vibrating agony that resonated deep within Nathan's skull. He could feel the cold radiating from the altar, an unnatural chill that seemed to emanate from the very core of hell. His gaze remained fixed on the altar, on the glistening pentagram of organs. The fresh blood that formed its points pulsed faintly, mirroring the rhythm of the demonic chant. He noticed now, with a fresh wave of nausea, that the organs were not merely arranged, they were connected, delicate tendrils of crimson tissue binding them, as if they were still part of a single monstrous living entity. The heart at the center, dark and engorged, seemed to beat with a slow, heavy throb, a counterpoint to the relentless chanting. Then the altar began to change. It was subtle at first, a shift in the way the light caught its surface. The stone, already stained crimson, seemed to deepen in color, becoming slicker, more viscous. A low, wet, squelching sound, like heavy boots in fresh mud, began to emanate from beneath it, growing steadily louder, pushing through the layered chanting. Nathan's breath hitched in his throat. He saw movement, not of light or shadow, but of mass. The pentagram of organs seemed to sink, to be drawn inward, as if the altar itself was swallowing them. The stone began to ripple, to soften, losing its rigid ancient form. It wasn't crumbling, it was metamorphosizing. From within its depths, faint groans, not of stone, but of something organic, began to rise, a chorus of muffled suffering that twisted Nathan's gut. The chanting of the unseen congregation intensified, rising to a fever pitch, a frantic, ecstatic devotion. Agramor, Agramor, 13th mouth. The altar, once a monolithic slab, began to swell, to distort. It was no longer made of rock, but of something fleshy, something malleable. Figures began to emerge, slowly, horribly, from its undulating surface. Not carved effigies, but faces, limbs, torsos, horribly compressed and stretched. They were hundreds of bodies, Nathan realized with a sickening lurch, not merely arranged upon the altar, but fused within it. Faces contorted in silent screams, stretched and pulled like taffy, their features indistinct, yet undeniably human. Arms, legs, ribs, all melded together, forming a rising, shifting mound of tormented flesh. The squelching sounds intensified, accompanied now by a wet, ripping noise, like muscle tearing from bone, or skin sloughing off in great, gruesome sheets. The entire structure began to rise, slowly at first, then with an accelerating, horrific momentum. It was a tower, a grotesque monument built of human agony. Corpses, not whole, but parts, hundreds of them, pressed together, their forms indistinct, yet their suffering palpable. A leg might terminate in a shoulder, a torso might sprout a dozen severed hands. Eyes, milky and dead, would briefly surface, only to be dragged back into the churning mass. A low, guttural growl, deep and resonant, began to emanate from the evolving monstrosity. It was not a single growl, but a layered, harmonic thrum, a chorus of primal rage and insatiable hunger. This was Agramor. It was a towering abomination, a living, pulsating edifice of fused, rotting flesh. It rose higher and higher, dwarfing the altar, scraping against the vaulted ceiling, its form impossibly vast, impossibly grotesque. Blackened horns, thick and jagged like petrified lightning, erupted from its uppermost mass, twisting skyward. From their tips, a dark, viscous liquid, thick as molten tar, began to drip, hissing faintly as it splattered onto the desecrated floor, leaving smoking pits in its wake. This was not blood in the conventional sense, but something far older, far more corrupt. Across its impossibly vast torso, dozens of mouths began to split open. Not merely orifices, but gaping, tooth-lined maws, each one distinct. Some were wide and lipless, revealing rows of needle-sharp fangs. Others were puckered and twisted, like the withered mouths of ancient men, yet still capable of an unholy roar. And from each mouth the chanting continued, a horrifying symphony of distinct pitches, each one contributing to the overwhelming liturgy. Sanctum caro, operite portum mortis, Agramor, Agramor, the 13th mouth is open. The chorus was deafening, 1,000 voices screaming through the demon's own flesh, echoing and layering until Nathan felt his own skull vibrate, his eardrums threatening to burst. Where Agramor moved, the very fabric of existence seemed to unravel. As its colossal, shapeless form shifted, the floor beneath it, the ancient stone that had stood for centuries, began to rot. It didn't merely crack, it softened, blistered, turning into a bubbling, viscous liquid. Not water, but blood. Fresh, hot, bubbling blood, thick and iron-scented, rising in steaming rivulets. The sound was sickening, the steady squelching of organs within Agramor's mass, the boiling of the blood as it consumed the stone, the soft, horrifying snap and grind of bones within its churning flesh, compressing and powdering under unimaginable pressure. Nathan felt his own legs begin to give way. The dread that had been a stone in his chest was now a crushing weight, stealing his breath, rendering his limbs useless. His flashlight, forgotten, slipped from his numb fingers, clattering to the blood-soaked floor, its beam flickering erratically before dying completely, plunging him back into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the screaming blue flames and the hellish glow emanating from the demon. The air around Agramore shimmered with a malevolent energy, a heat that seared Nathan's skin despite the cold of the cathedral. The molten blood dripping from its horns sizzled as it hit the floor, sending plumes of acrid vapor into the air. The sounds were overwhelming, the squelch of its internal organs, the layered growls emanating from its multitude of mouths, the blood boiling around its base, the constant, sickening crunch of bones being pulverized within its very substance. It was the sound of a living nightmare, a physical manifestation of all the suffering and malice the world had ever known, and it was here, in the heart of Blackthorn Cathedral. Nathan could only stare, paralyzed by a terror so profound it transcended mere fear. It was an existential dread, a spiritual immolation. This was not a demon from ancient texts, a concept to be debated and analyzed. This was raw, unadulterated evil, made flesh, made screaming, suffering, consuming flesh. Its countless eyes, or what appeared to be eyes, embedded in the fused bodies, seemed to turn, to focus, to pierce through the gloom and fix upon him. The chanting from its myriad mouths shifted, becoming singular, a focused, predatory whisper that somehow cut through the cacophony of its own layered growls. The scent of the theologist. Each word was a different pitch, a different timbre, yet perfectly synchronized, creating a chilling, multi-voiced utterance. A fresh vessel, the final sacrifice. Nathan tried to scream, but no sound escaped his constricted throat. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The towering abomination, Agramore, slowly, deliberately, began to turn its colossal mass towards him. The sound of boiling blood and squelching organs, a terrifying prelude to its approach. The ground where it had stood was a smoking, boiling pool of gore, and now, as it began to shift, the path towards Nathan began to liquefy, the stone groaning, dissolving into bubbling crimson. He could feel its immense, malevolent presence bearing down on him, a weight that threatened to crush his very soul. He was utterly, hopelessly trapped, a single, insignificant lamb in the maw of a thousand-mouthed wolf. The blue flames screamed their silent warning, the black blood wept from the saints, and the demon of fused flesh, Agramore, the 13th mouth of hell, had finally turned its unholy attention upon him. He could not move, could not think, could only feel the icy tendrils of absolute horror coiling around his heart, waiting for the inevitable. The ancient, unholy ritual was far from complete, and Nathan Hale was no longer merely a witness, he was becoming a part of it. Part 3. The overwhelming presence of Agramore, the 13th mouth of hell, was a physical force, pressing down on Nathan, stealing the very air from his lungs. Its colossal, multi-mouthed form, a grotesque tapestry of fused, suffering flesh, loomed over him, slowly, inexorably turning. The sounds that accompanied its movement were a symphony of damnation, the wet, sickening squelch of internal organs churning, the layered, guttural growls emanating from its myriad mouths, the horrifying boil of blood as it consumed the ancient stone floor, turning it into a smoking crimson mire. Molten blood dripped from its blackened horns, hissing as it met the bubbling gore beneath. The chanting, which now seemed to come from Agramore's very essence, echoed through the cathedral, resonating in Nathan's bones. The scent of the ologist, a fresh vessel, the final sacrifice. The words, delivered in a terrifying chorus of distinct pitches, were a death knell. Nathan's mind, battered and broken by the onslaught of horrors, screamed for escape, even as his body remained frozen, paralyzed by an animalistic terror. But the demon's immense size, its very composition of fused flesh, rendered its movements ponderous, a slow, deliberate turning of a mountain of agony. The boiling blood spread outwards from its base, but it was not fast enough to immediately engulf Nathan. In that infinitesimal sliver of time, a primal instinct, a desperate, gasping surge of adrenaline seized him. His legs, stiff with dread, suddenly found a desperate, jerky strength. He didn't think, he reacted. With a choked cry that was lost in the demon's bellow, Nathan stumbled backward, away from the encroaching pool of boiling blood, away from the immense, multi-mawed face that was slowly, inevitably, swiveling towards him. He scrambled blindly, his hands scraping against the rough, blood-soaked stone floor, his eyes darting through the oppressive gloom. He needed cover, escape, a moment of respite from the all-consuming evil. His frantic retreat brought him not towards the cathedral's entrance, which seemed miles away, but further into the shadows behind the towering abomination that now occupied the space where the altar had once been. The air here was marginally cooler, though still thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid scent of ozone. His outstretched hand, slick with some unseen ichor, brushed against a section of the wall that felt different, colder, smoother. It wasn't stone. It was wood, a massive panel, almost seamlessly integrated into the crumbling masonry. There was no visible handle, no obvious seam, yet as his fingers traced its edge, he felt a faint tremor, a slight give. The chanting from Agramore's mouths, still focused on its rising power, momentarily seemed to ebb in its direct intensity, though its reverberations still shook the very foundations of the building. With a desperate, choked gasp, Nathan pushed. The panel, heavy and ancient, groaned inwards, not swinging like a door, but sliding with a deep, rasping scrape against unseen runners. It revealed a narrow, vertical slit of absolute blackness, a deeper void than the gloom of the cathedral itself. Without a second thought, driven by an instinct for survival that overrode all reason, Nathan squeezed through the opening, the wood scraping against his shoulders. He tumbled into the darkness beyond, landing hard on cold, damp stone, the panel sliding shut behind him with a soft, resonant thud, sealing him in. The sudden silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the cacophony he had just escaped. Only the faint, muffled echo of Agramore's layered growls and the distant, layered chanting reached him now, a dim, terrifying hum through the thick walls. Nathan lay there for a moment, gasping, trying to regain his bearings. The air here was different too, stagnant, cloying, heavy with the scent of aged blood, dust, and something else, something fetid and sickly sweet, like decaying parchment and withered flowers. He fumbled for his forgotten flashlight, but it was gone, lost somewhere in the boiling blood of the nave. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, but then a faint, flickering red glow caught his eye. It was not fire, but an organic luminescence, pulsing faintly from the center of the hidden chamber. Nathan pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest, and forced himself to look. The chamber was small, circular, and utterly horrifying. The red light emanated from the floor, where intricate symbols had been drawn in what was undeniably blood. These symbols were not merely painted, they throbbed faintly, a network of crimson lines that pulsed like engorged veins, their light casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and retracted like grasping fingers. The air in the chamber felt thick, heavy with an oppressive, malevolent energy that pressed down on Nathan, making his skin crawl. At the center of the pulsating blood circle, arranged with meticulous, chilling precision, were 13 severed human heads. They were not fresh, but desiccated, mummified by time and some unnatural process, their skin pulled taut over bone, their eye sockets hollow and black. Yet, despite their age, they seemed to retain a horrifying sentience. Their expressions, frozen in eternal agony, twisted into silent screams, mouths agape, as if eternally caught in the throes of their final, unspeakable moments. They were arranged in a perfect circle, their gazes, or where their gazes would have been, all directed inwards, towards the very center of the ritual space. Just outside this gruesome circle, resting upon a makeshift pedestal carved from a single blackened beam of wood, sat a chalice. It was not made of precious metal, but of a human skull, meticulously cleaned and polished, its cranium hollowed out to form a cup. Dark, viscous liquid, thick and oily, pooled within its bony concavity, reflecting the throbbing crimson light from the floor like a stagnant, malevolent eye. The scent of that liquid reached Nathan, a heavy, sickly sweet perfume of decay and dark, forbidden power. His eyes, wide with a horror that was rapidly consuming his sanity, moved to the final, most terrifying object in the chamber. Resting on a smaller, similarly carved stand near the back wall, was a massive grimoire. It was bound not in leather or vellum, but in stitched human skin, its surface a patchwork of pallid, scarred flesh, adorned with faded, intricate symbols carved directly into the skin itself. Thick, coarse sutures, black as tar, held the gruesome cover together, creating raised ridges that felt disturbingly like a monstrous anatomy. The pages, thick and yellowed, seemed to hum with an unseen energy, a dark knowledge radiating outwards. A morbid curiosity, a scholarly compulsion that even the terror could not entirely extinguish, drew Nathan towards the grimoire. His hands trembled as he reached for it, his fingers brushing against the cold, almost silky texture of the stitched skin. It felt undeniably human, a desecration that made his stomach clench. He opened it, the ancient pages rustling with a dry, papery whisper, like the breath of a dying man. The script within was Latin, intricately penned in dark, dried blood, though some passages seemed to be written in a language far older, far more twisted, a script that seemed to writhe and contort on the page. Nathan, a student of theology and ancient languages, found himself able to decipher the Latin, though each word clawed at his soul. It was a chronicle, a horrifying confession. The Blackthorn Cathedral, once a beacon of faith, had harbored a secret order of priests, men who had succumbed to the allure of forbidden power. They had secretly worshipped Satan, not as a distant abstract evil, but as a tangible entity seeking to harness its might. The grimoire detailed their rituals, their sacrifices, their descent into utter depravity. It spoke of their ultimate ambition, to call forth Agrimor, the 13th mouth of hell, not to be devoured, but to command it, to wield its power for their own unholy ends. Nathan's eyes scanned the gruesome pages, his breath catching in his throat. The language was chillingly precise, detailing the specific incantations, the types of sacrifices required. 13 pure souls, their heads offered in a circle, their blood to fuel the vessel. His gaze flickered to the 13 desiccated heads, their silent screams echoing the grimoire's words. The chalice of blood, the pulsing symbols on the floor. It was all a blueprint, a horrifying instruction manual for the ritual now unfolding in the cathedral above. And then he found the final damning entry, scrawled in a shaky, desperate hand, the blood ink smeared as if the scribe had been interrupted, consumed in their final moments. It was a terrifying epilogue to their grand ambition. They came. They succeeded. The gate was opened. Agrimor manifested, but not to serve, never to serve. The words blurred before Nathan's eyes, his mind struggling to comprehend. It did not grant power. It consumed it. It devoured us. All of us. We are absorbed. We are part of the 13th mouth. Our voices, now its voices. Our flesh, its flesh. The last lines were a frantic scrawl, a terrified realization. It is not a servant. It is the master, and it hungers for the final key, the theologian, the last pure soul. The grimoire slipped from Nathan's numb fingers, clattering softly onto the stone floor, the sound impossibly loud in the deathly quiet of the chamber. The truth, stark and horrifying, slammed into him. The priests had not called Agrimor to gain power. They had called it to become its sustenance, its very substance. Their ambition had been their undoing, their flesh and souls now part of the monstrous abomination in the nave, their voices contributing to its hellish chorus. They were the building blocks of the demon, consumed and incorporated, their screams now the layered growls of Agrimor itself. And he, Nathan Hale, the theology student who had come seeking answers, was the final key, the last ingredient, the pure soul needed to complete the ritual. He was not an observer, not an intruder. He was the intended sacrifice, the culmination of centuries of dark worship. The muffled sounds from beyond the wall, the low growl and the distant, layered chanting seemed to intensify, no longer a mere echo, but a knowing presence. A chill, colder than any he had ever known, seeped into Nathan's bones, a profound, spiritual cold that went beyond physical temperature. He was trapped in a chamber of death, a sacrifice destined for the ultimate blasphemy. The walls of the cathedral, the very air he breathed, felt alive, sentient, and utterly, malevolently aware of his presence. The hunt, he knew, had just begun anew. The words of the grimoire, scrawled in desperate, blood-inked terror, echoed in Nathan's mind, a chilling prophecy now horribly fulfilled. The final key, the theologian, the last pure soul. He was not merely trapped, he was marked. The realization solidified into a leaden weight in his stomach, turning his blood to ice. He stumbled backward, away from the grim ledger of damnation, his eyes darting wildly around the small, suffocating chamber. The pulsating blood symbols on the floor seemed to throb with a renewed intensity, their crimson glow mirroring the frantic beat of his own heart. The 13 desiccated heads, their silent screams eternally etched, seemed to watch him with hollow, knowing eyes. From beyond the hidden panel, the muffled growls and layered chanting of Agrimor intensified, no longer a distant hum, but a resonant vibration that permeated the very stone, rattling Nathan's teeth. The walls of the secret chamber, once a temporary sanctuary, now felt like the interior of a tomb, slowly compressing around him. The air, already thick with the scent of old blood and decay, grew heavy, charged with an oppressive, malevolent energy. He heard it then, a new sound, distinct from the demon's internal cacophony, a low, resonant thrumming emanating from the cathedral itself. It was not a structural sound, but something organic, something alive. The thrumming grew, slowly at first, then accelerating, a deep, rhythmic pulse that vibrated through the floor and up into Nathan's very bones. It was like a colossal heart beating, a monstrous lung expanding and contracting. The entire cathedral was becoming alive. A faint, sickly light, a ghastly green, began to seep through the ancient stone of the hidden chamber, emanating from the walls themselves. Nathan pressed his palm against the rough-hewn surface and felt it, a subtle, undulating movement, a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction. The stone was no longer inert, it was breathing. The cathedral was a living, monstrous organism, its very architecture imbued with the demonic energy of Agrimor. A distant, horrifying crack echoed through the vibrating walls, followed by another and another. It was the sound of ancient glass shattering under immense pressure. Nathan knew with a sick certainty that the stained glass windows were giving way. But it wasn't just breaking glass, it was something far worse. Through the faint green light, he saw slender, dark rivulets beginning to seep from the hairline cracks in the chamber's walls, trickling down like slow, black tears. The stained glass, he realized, was not merely cracking, it was bleeding. The black blood, thick and viscous, that had streamed from the statue's eyes in the nave, was now weeping from the very fabric of the cathedral, testifying to its complete, unholy transformation. The hidden panel, Nathan's only barrier, suddenly groaned, a deep, tormented sound of ancient wood under strain. The muffled chanting from the nave intensified, gaining a new predatory urgency. The final key, the 13th mouth, it hungers. A cold, sharp shiver raked down Nathan's spine. Agrimor knew he was here. It wasn't just searching, it was reaching. The subtle vibrations in the stone intensified, becoming violent tremors. Dust rained down from the ceiling, mingling with the black blood that was now oozing more freely from the walls. The green light intensified, painting the severed heads in a ghastly, unholy glow, making their mummified features seem to twist in renewed agony. The chalice of blood on the pedestal seemed to boil gently, sending up thin tendrils of dark vapor. Then, from the cathedral beyond, came an utterly horrifying sound. It was a prolonged metallic shriek, a sound of ancient metal tearing and twisting. Nathan recognized it with a jolt of pure terror. The pews, the massive, immovable oak pews, which had stood for centuries, were being warped, violently transformed. He could hear the snapping and grinding of wood, the splintering and creaking, punctuated by grotesque pops and snaps that sounded sickeningly like bones. The hidden panel suddenly shuddered, a deep, violent tremor running through its surface. A faint, sickening smell, like scorched bone and stale charnel, began to seep through the cracks. The metallic shriek intensified, accompanied by a chorus of spectral groans that seemed to emanate from the pews themselves. Nathan pictured it with horrifying clarity, the ancient wood twisting, knotting, reforming into grotesque bone cages, trapping unseen souls, perhaps the lingering spirits of the long-dead worshippers who had once sought solace here. The cathedral was devouring its own history, its own remnants of sanctity, transforming them into instruments of agony. Suddenly, with a tremendous splintering crack, the hidden panel burst inward, ripped from its ancient runners. It didn't fall, but was violently flung aside, revealing the terrifying vista of the nave. The green light, now emanating from every wall, every pillar, pulsed with a sickening rhythm. The air was thick with mist, a vaporous exhalation from the living cathedral, smelling of blood and decay. A grammar, a colossal mountain of fused, suffering flesh, stood at the heart of the nave, its multiple mouths roaring a triumphant, layered chant. The boiling blood around its base churned violently, sending up sprays of crimson mist. Its blackened horns dripped molten tar, which sizzled as it hit the ground. But it was what surrounded the demon that truly froze Nathan's blood. The pews, indeed, had twisted. They were no longer pews, but grotesque cages of blackened skeletal wood, sharp splinters jutting out like broken bones, some still faintly pulsing with a sickly green light. Within these cages, Nathan thought he saw faint, fleeting shadows, figures of agony, trapped and screaming. And then his eyes found the altar, or what remained of it. The inverted crucifix that had adorned the altar, once a symbol of desecration, was now undergoing its own horrifying transformation. The ancient wood, already stained with black blood and wrapped in intestines, began to soften, to liquefy. It melted, not burning, but dissolving into a viscous, churning mass. And from this melting mass, faces began to emerge, hundreds of them, pale and writhing, their features contorted in silent, eternal screams. The crucifix was transforming into a writhing mass of tormented souls, a living sculpture of pure agony, their cries adding a silent yet deafening shriek to the cacophony of the cathedral. Nathan was exposed, completely vulnerable. He tried to move, to run, but his legs were leaden, his will utterly broken. A tendril of black blood, thicker than any he had seen, snaked out from the floor, pulsating with that ghastly green light. It wrapped around his ankle, cold and slimy, yet incredibly strong. More tendrils emerged, from the floor, from the walls, from the very air, coiling around his other leg, his torso, his arms, binding him with an inescapable living restraint. He was dragged slowly, inexorably, across the blood-soaked floor towards the towering, multi-mouthed monstrosity that was Agramor. The black blood tendrils tightened, biting into his flesh, chilling him to the bone. The sounds were overwhelming, consuming his senses. The cathedral's beating walls, the shattering, bleeding glass, the screaming faces of the melting crucifix, the squelching and boiling within Agramor and its layered, triumphant roar. As he was pulled closer, the demon's many mouths opened wider, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth, each one black and dripping with some corrosive ichor. Its gaze, a composite of countless dead eyes embedded in its flesh, was fixed upon him, a gaze of unholy hunger. The chants from its various maws shifted, becoming singular, focused, terrifyingly clear. Your soul is the final key. The 13th mouth ritual begins. Nathan screamed, a raw, primal sound ripped from the deepest part of his being, but it was swallowed by the demon's roar, by the cathedral's living agony. He was dragged to the base of Agramor, to the edge of the boiling blood. The heat was immense, searing his skin, the stench of decay and iron overwhelming. He looked up into the impossibly vast, multi-mouthed face of the demon and saw not just malice, but an ancient, insatiable hunger that had consumed worlds. He was the final offering, the last piece required to complete the ultimate blasphemy. He knew with a horrifying certainty that this was not merely death, but something far, far worse. The 13th mouth ritual was about to claim its final, most precious victim. Part 5. The black blood tendrils, cold and slimy, yet imbued with an unholy, irresistible strength, tightened their grip around Nathan Hale. They pulsed with that sickening green light, biting into his flesh, drawing him relentlessly across the blood-soaked floor. The cathedral, a living, monstrous entity, throbbed around him, its walls beating like colossal lungs, its bleeding stained glass weeping dark ichor. The air, thick with the stench of decay, iron, and the acrid tang of ozone, scalded his throat with every ragged breath. He was dragged to the base of Agramor, to the very edge of the boiling crimson pool that churned around the demon's colossal form. The heat radiating from it was immense, a searing inferno that blistered his skin. The sounds were a hammer blow to his remaining sanity, the squelching and grinding within Agramor's fused flesh, the liquid roar of the boiling blood, the silent screams of the melting crucifix, and above all, the layered, triumphant chant erupting from the demon's countless mouths. Your soul is the final key. The 13th mouth ritual begins. Nathan looked up, his eyes wide with an absolute, soul-shattering terror, into the impossibly vast, multi-mod face of the demon. It was a landscape of human suffering, a mountain of tormented flesh, its blackened horns dripping molten tar that hissed as it struck the churning blood. The countless eyes embedded in its body seemed to fixate on him, a composite gaze of ancient, insatiable hunger that had consumed worlds, devoured civilizations, and now focused its ravenous intent upon his singular, terrified soul. He could feel its malevolent will pressing against his mind, a spiritual invasion, attempting to pry open the very core of his being. He struggled, thrashing against the blood tendrils that bound him, his muscles screaming in protest, but it was futile. They held him fast, an offering prepared for a god of blasphemy. Agramor's roars intensified, echoing through the pulsating cathedral, vibrating in Nathan's very bones. The blue flames, burning along the altar and on makeshift pedestals, flared with renewed agony, their silent screams now a deafening crescendo in his mind. Then the demon began to shift its colossal weight. The earth itself seemed to groan beneath the strain. A low, tearing sound, wet and sickening, began to emanate from Agramor's central mass. It was not the tearing of cloth or wood, but the ripping of muscle and sinew, of ancient fused flesh. The very chest of the abomination began to split, not merely opening, but rending itself asunder. The opening widened, slowly, deliberately, revealing a yawning chasm within. It was not an empty cavity, but a colossal tooth-lined maw, larger than any he had ever conceived. The teeth were obsidian shards, jagged and black, like shattered obsidian, each one the size of a man's forearm, glistening with a viscous, translucent fluid. From the depths of this newly revealed, horrifying mouth, a thick, dark liquid, acid blood, dripped and sizzled, not merely on the ground, but also along the jagged teeth, hissing softly, sending up plumes of acrid, burning vapor that stung Nathan's eyes and lungs. This was it. This was the 13th mouth. A groan of immense, almost cosmic satisfaction rippled through Agramor's many voices as this ultimate maw yawned fully open. The light from within it was not fire, but a deeper, more profound darkness, an absence that seemed to drink the light from the screaming blue flames. The stench that erupted from it was overwhelming, a concentrated essence of charnel and decay mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of fresh, potent acid. The black blood tendrils lifted Nathan, not gently, but with a horrifying, calculated precision. He was suspended in the air, directly before the colossal tooth-lined maw, his body trembling uncontrollably. The heat from the demon's breath, rank and putrid, washed over him, searing his skin. He could feel the vibrations of its internal organs, the squelching, the grinding, the boiling of blood, all intensified by his proximity. He stared, utterly paralyzed, into the abyss of the 13th mouth. With a speed that belied its immense size, Agramore lunged, not fully, but with a sickening, snapping motion of its newly revealed maw. Nathan felt an unimaginable force tear into his right arm. A scream, raw and primal, ripped from his throat, a sound of pure agony that was immediately swallowed by the demon's thunderous roar. He heard the sickening snap of bone, the wet rip of muscle and sinew, the tearing of flesh. The acid blood, dripping from the demon's teeth, instantly began to dissolve the exposed bone and tissue, an excruciating burning that went beyond pain, delving into a realm of pure, unadulterated suffering. His arm was gone, consumed in a single brutal bite, the tendril still holding him aloft, blood gushing from the stump, sizzling as it met the demon's acidic saliva. The pain was a white-hot supernova in his mind, threatening to shatter his consciousness, but the ritual demanded more. As the tendrils held him steady, the demon's multitudinous mouths began to chant again, focused, insistent, weaving a spell not just of sound, but of pure, dark will. Sanctum caro, aperite portum mortis, Agramor, Agramor. The words hammered into Nathan's skull, bypassing his ears, invading his thoughts. And then the horrifying phenomenon began. Even as he screamed, even as the agony of his severed arm threatened to consume him, words began to escape his lips. They were not his words. They were guttural, ancient, syllables of pure evil erupting from his throat, unbidden, unwanted. He was screaming, yes, but intertwined with his screams were the chants of the demon, a horrifying duet of pain and blasphemy. He was forced to participate, to voice his own damnation, his own surrender. Sanctum caro, aperite portum mortis. The demon was not just consuming his flesh, it was consuming his will, his very voice, turning him into a conduit for its own foul liturgy. The 13th mouth descended again, a shadow of teeth and acid. This time it clamped down on his head, his face. The pain was beyond comprehension. He felt the crushing force, the splintering of bone, the tearing of skin. His eyes, fixed on the horrifying maw, melted in their sockets, consumed by the acid. His screams became a gurgling, mangled sound, his forced chants twisting into an unrecognizable, monstrous shriek. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of agony, sound, and searing heat. His body began to warp, not just from the damage, but from an internal, demonic transformation. Bones snapped backward with sickening cracks, limbs twisting into impossible angles. Flesh tore and stretched, not bleeding, but reforming, fusing, melding. His chest caved in, his spine contorted, his remaining features melting and flowing like wax. He was no longer Nathan Hale, the theology student. He was raw material, being reshaped, repurposed. The tendrils released him, allowing him to slump, his form no longer human, but a writhing, amorphous mass of flesh and bone, still vaguely recognizable, yet rapidly losing its individual identity. He was falling, not to the floor, but towards Agramore's immense torso. He felt himself being absorbed, pulled into the demon's churning, living mass, his consciousness fading, fragmenting, becoming diffuse. His last remaining sensation was the agonizing, grotesque reshaping, his skin stretched taut, his internal organs reconfigured, his remaining bones snapping and grinding into new forms. His mouth, or what remained of it, widened, tearing at the edges, rows of new black teeth erupting from his gums, his tongue elongating, twisting. His vision, or what passed for it, caught a final horrific glimpse. He was becoming a new mouth, a fresh, raw orifice on the demon's colossal, multi-mouthed torso. His identity, his essence was being dissolved, becoming merely another voice in Agrimor's endless chorus of damnation, another segment of its fused, suffering flesh. The cathedral shook then, not with tremors, but with a mighty, triumphant convulsion. The walls pulsed violently, the green light flaring to an unbearable intensity. The black blood wept from every crack, every crevice, overflowing its channels, coating the entire nave in a glistening, viscous sheen. The cages of bone-twisted pews groaned, and the melting crucifix of screaming faces contorted in a final silent agony. The ritual was complete. From Agrimor, the 13th mouth of hell, came a sound that rent the very fabric of reality. It was not a chant, not a growl, but a single, unified roar, 1,000 voices merging into one colossal, deafening peal of pure, unholy triumph. It vibrated through the stone, through the air, through the very earth, rising to an unbearable pitch. And then the ancient bells of Blackthorn Cathedral, which had hung silent for centuries, suddenly shattered, not with a clang, but with an explosive crack, their bronze bodies fragmenting into 1,000 razor-sharp shards that rained down upon the desecrated ground, each piece ringing with the echo of Agrimor's final victorious scream. The sound lingered, a deafening silence punctuated by the slow, rhythmic thump-thump of the cathedral's living walls, now a monument to eternal darkness. Nathan Hale was gone, his voice, his flesh, his soul, forever bound within the insatiable maw of the 13th mouth.